Well, 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 Judge Wade Thornfield chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension as he looked down from his elevated bench. And you are? He squinted at the black woman standing at the witness stand, her plain business suit and modest appearance clearly amusing him. Some kind of glorified secretary, I presume? Here to tell us about filing systems and coffee schedules? The Superior Court of Riverside County had seen many prejudiced moments, but what was about to unfold would become legendary. Diana Reeves stood perfectly still at the witness stand, her hands clasped behind her back. She wore a simple navy suit that could have been purchased at any department store. Her only jewelry was a plain watch and small silver earrings. To everyone in the courtroom, she looked like exactly what Judge Thornfield suggested, a mid-level administrative employee caught up in something far beyond her understanding. I'm here to provide testimony regarding systematic discriminatory practices at Meridian Technologies, Your Honor. Oh, systematic practices? My. Such big words from someone who probably struggles to operate the office copy machine. The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter from the gallery packed with Meridian Tech executives. According to the official court transcript, case number CV 2024-7851, filed at 2:47 p.m. on this Tuesday afternoon, Diana Reeves was listed simply as Administrative Witness, Employment Records. What the transcript didn't show, what no one in that room knew, was that this unassuming woman had been building the most comprehensive federal corruption case in California's history. For 18 months, she had been gathering evidence of a conspiracy that reached from corporate boardrooms to judicial chambers. But they were about to discover something else entirely, something that would turn their world upside down in the next 2 hours. The lock clicks twice, then silence. The Riverside County Superior Court building cast long shadows across the morning plaza as Diana Reeves approached the main entrance at 7:45 a.m. She moved with deliberate precision, her eyes scanning the security checkpoints, noting the positioning of surveillance cameras, and observing the flow of personnel through metal detectors. To any casual observer, she appeared to be yet another nervous witness arriving early for court proceedings. But her attention to detail suggested something more. A habit of systematic observation that spoke to years of professional training. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the familiar chaos of morning proceedings. Attorneys wheeled briefcases toward elevators, defendants clutched manila folders containing their futures, and court personnel moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Diana positioned herself near a marble pillar, extracting a small leather notebook from her jacket pocket. She began making careful notations, her handwriting precise and economical. "Ma'am, you'll need to take a seat in the public gallery," announced the court clerk, a woman whose tone carried the weary authority of someone who had directed thousands of confused visitors. She barely glanced at Diana's witness summons before pointing toward the back rows of wooden benches. "Witnesses wait with everyone else until called." Diana accepted the dismissal without protest, though she noted the clerk's failure to follow proper witness protocol as outlined in California Rules of Court, Rule 3.1403. She simply nodded and moved toward the designated seating area, her composure unshaken by the casual disrespect. This reaction, or lack thereof, would have puzzled anyone familiar with typical witness behavior. Most people summoned to federal civil rights proceedings arrived with visible anxiety, yet Diana exhibited the controlled demeanor of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. The main courtroom of Judge Wade Thornfield represented everything traditional about American jurisprudence. Dark wooden paneling rose toward a coffered ceiling, while oil portraits of distinguished jurists gazed down from gilded frames. The judge's bench towered above the proceedings like an altar to authority, and Thornfield himself had positioned his chair to maximize the psychological impact of his elevated position. At the plaintiff's table, attorney Tessa Hartwell shuffled through stacks of evidence documents, her movements betraying the nervous energy of someone facing an uphill battle. She represented Malik Johnson and 300 other former Meridian Technologies employees in what legal observers had dubbed the most significant workplace discrimination case in California's tech industry. The evidence was substantial. Internal emails revealing racial bias in hiring, documented patterns of unequal treatment, and statistical analysis showing systematic exclusion of minority candidates from advanced positions. Across the aisle, Meridian's legal team presented a stark contrast. Led by Sloan McKenzie, a partner at the prestigious firm of McKenzie, Whitmore & Associates, they exuded the confidence that came with unlimited resources and political connections. McKenzie herself was a formidable opponent, Harvard Law Review, former federal clerk, and widely regarded as one of the most ruthless corporate defenders on the West Coast. Her reputation for dismantling opposing witnesses was legendary, and her presence signaled that Meridian Technologies intended to win at any cost. Behind the defense table, CEO Harper Voss surveyed the courtroom with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to controlling every variable in her environment. Voss had built Meridian from a small startup into a multi-billion-dollar government contractor, specializing in surveillance software and data analysis systems used by law enforcement agencies nationwide. Her company's technology powered everything from traffic cameras to homeland security databases, making her one of the most influential figures in California's tech ecosystem. Standing near the courtroom's side entrance, Security Chief Gage Morton maintained what appeared to be a casual position, but was actually a strategic observation post. Morton's background included 15 years with private military contractors before joining Meridian's corporate security division. His role officially involved protecting company executives, but his presence in civil proceedings raised questions about the lengths to which Meridian would go to protect its interests. The morning's proceedings began with Judge Thornfield's characteristic mixture of impatience and barely concealed bias. He had presided over Riverside County's Superior Court for nearly 2 decades, building a reputation for swift case resolution and unwavering support for the county's major employers. His connections to Meridian Technologies ran deep. His country club membership was sponsored by Harper Voss. His judicial campaign had received substantial contributions from tech industry executives, and his son worked as a consultant for companies in Meridian's supplier network. "This court will come to order, Matter," Thornfield announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged. "Ms. Hartwell, I trust you're prepared to present your case expeditiously. This court has no patience for fishing expeditions or grandstanding." Tessa Hartwell rose from her seat, acutely aware that she was walking into hostile territory. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff is ready to proceed with evidence of systematic discrimination affecting hundreds of employees at Meridian Technologies." "Alleged discrimination," Sloan Mackenzie corrected from the defense table, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "My client categorically denies any discriminatory practices and looks forward to exposing this lawsuit for what it truly is, an attempt to extract an undeserved settlement from a successful American corporation." The gallery stirred with murmurs of approval from Meridian employees, who had been granted time off to attend the proceedings. Their presence was no accident. Harper Voss understood the importance of controlling narratives, and a courtroom packed with supportive workers sent a clear message about company solidarity. Diana observed these dynamics from her position in the back rows, her trained eye cataloging the relationships, power structures, and potential pressure points that would shape the day's events. She noted the eye contact between Judge Thornfield and Harper Voss, the coordinated positioning of Meridian security personnel, and the subtle intimidation tactics being employed against potential witnesses. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone underestimates the wrong person? The kind of person who's spent years building a case that could bring down an entire corrupt system? Well, you're about to find out. Hit that like button if you're ready to see true power in action, and let's dive deeper into this incredible story. The morning session proceeded with predictable hostility toward the plaintiff's case. Judge Thornfield sustained nearly every defense objection while overruling Tessa Hartwell's attempts to introduce evidence of discriminatory patterns. When Malik Johnson took the stand to describe his experiences as one of only 3 black engineers in Meridian's Advanced Systems Division, Thornfield interrupted him repeatedly, claiming his testimony was irrelevant and inflammatory. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, leaning forward with obvious irritation, "this court is interested in facts, not feelings. Did my client violate specific employment regulations, yes or no?" "Your Honor, the systematic exclusion of qualified minority candidates from promotion opportunities constitutes a clear violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act," Johnson replied, his voice steady despite the obvious hostility. "Objection," Sloan Mackenzie called out, rising from her chair with theatrical precision. "The witness is not qualified to interpret federal employment law." "Sustained," Thornfield ruled immediately. "The jury will disregard the witness's legal conclusions." This pattern continued throughout the morning as Meridian's legal team systematically dismantled the plaintiff's case through procedural objections and judicial bias. By 11:30 a.m., it was clear that conventional legal strategies would not penetrate the wall of corruption protecting Meridian Technologies. During the lunch recess, Diana remained in the courtroom while most attendees dispersed to nearby restaurants and coffee shops. She used this time to examine the physical layout more carefully, noting the positions of security cameras, the locations of emergency exits, and the sightlines between various seating areas. Her behavior resembled that of someone conducting a security assessment rather than simply waiting to testify. Marcus Sterling, the deputy district attorney assigned to monitor the proceedings, approached Diana during this period. Sterling's presence at a civil trial was unusual. Typically, criminal prosecutors only observed cases that might generate referrals for criminal charges. His interest in the Meridian lawsuit suggested that someone in law enforcement was paying close attention to the proceedings. "Ms. Reeves, isn't it?" Sterling said, consulting a tablet computer. "I understand you're scheduled to testify about employment records?" "That's correct," Diana replied, offering no additional information. "And your position at Meridian Technologies?" "I work with data analysis and compliance protocols." Sterling's expression suggested he found her responses unsatisfactory, but he made no effort to probe deeper. Instead, he retreated to his position near the prosecution table, where he spent the remainder of the recess engaged in hushed conversations with court personnel. The afternoon session began with Judge Thornfield's announcement that witness testimony would be limited to relevant facts directly related to employment decisions. This restriction effectively gutted the plaintiff's ability to demonstrate the systematic nature of Meridian's discriminatory practices, reducing complex patterns of bias to isolated incidents that could be easily explained away. "Your Honor," Tessa Hartwell protested, "Federal Rules of Civil Procedure Rule 26B1 specifically allows discovery of information that appears reasonably calculated to lead to admissible evidence. Restricting witness testimony in this manner violates established precedent." Thornfield's response was swift and dismissive. "Ms. Hartwell, this is my courtroom, and I will determine what constitutes relevant evidence. Your objection is noted and overruled." Diana watched this exchange with particular interest, mentally cataloging the judge's willingness to violate established federal procedures. His citation was incorrect. Rule 26 dealt with discovery in federal court, while this was a state proceeding that should have been governed by California Evidence Code Section 352. The error suggested either ignorance of basic legal principles or deliberate disregard for proper procedure. When Diana's name was finally called at 2:15 p.m., she approached the witness stand with measured steps that betrayed no nervousness or excitement. Her demeanor remained perfectly controlled as she raised her right hand and was sworn in by the court clerk. "State your name and occupation for the record," Tessa Hartwell began. "Diana Reeves. I analyze data systems and compliance protocols for organizational risk assessment." Judge Thornfield leaned forward, his expression already skeptical. "What exactly does that mean in plain English, Ms. Reeves? Are you some kind of computer technician?" "I evaluate institutional practices for adherence to federal guidelines, Your Honor." Sloan Mackenzie immediately sensed an opportunity to undermine Diana's credibility. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is being deliberately vague about her qualifications and role. How can this court evaluate the reliability of her testimony if she won't clearly state her position?" "Sustained," Thornfield ruled. "Ms. Reeves, answer the question directly. What is your job title at Meridian Technologies?" Diana paused for precisely 3 seconds, long enough to create tension without appearing evasive. "I serve as a compliance analyst, Your Honor. My role involves ensuring that organizational practices meet federal employment standards as outlined in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent regulatory guidance." The specificity of her legal citation caught several people off guard. Compliance analysts typically dealt with basic paperwork and filing requirements, not complex federal employment law. Her casual reference to specific statutes suggested knowledge that extended far beyond typical administrative responsibilities. Marcus Sterling looked up from his tablet, his attention now fully focused on the witness stand. Harper Voss leaned forward in her seat, her expression shifting from boredom to concern. Even Judge Thornfield seemed momentarily unsure how to respond to Diana's precise legal language. "Speaking of evidence and security, protecting your digital life is more important than ever. With Legal Shield's identity theft protection, you get comprehensive monitoring of your personal information, credit reports, and dark web surveillance. Professional investigators work around the clock to protect what matters most. Try Legal Shield risk-free for 30 days and get the peace of mind that comes from having legal experts on your side." Just like Diana had the full power of the FBI behind her, Tessa Hartwell recognized an opportunity to advance her case. "Ms. Reeves, in your role analyzing compliance with federal employment standards, what did you observe regarding Meridian Technologies' hiring and promotion practices?" "Objection," Sloan Mackenzie called out, rising from her chair. "Foundation. The witness hasn't established any expertise in employment law or statistics." "Your Honor," Diana interjected before Tessa could respond. "California Evidence Code Section 701 clearly states that expert opinion may be admitted if the witness has special knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education sufficient to qualify them as an expert on the subject." My analysis is based on documented patterns in employment data spanning a 3-year period. The courtroom fell silent. Diana had not only challenged the defense objection, but cited specific evidence code with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with legal procedure. This was not the behavior of a typical administrative employee. Judge Thornfield's face darkened with irritation. Ms. Reeves, you are here to answer questions, not to lecture this court on legal procedure. Ms. Mackenzie's objection is sustained. With respect, Your Honor, Diana replied, her voice remaining perfectly calm. The objection lacks legal foundation under established precedent. The California Supreme Court's decision in People v. Kelly established clear standards for expert testimony that support the admissibility of my analysis. The audible gasp from the gallery reflected the shock of witnessing a witness directly challenge a sitting judge's ruling. Even experienced attorneys rarely questioned judicial decisions so boldly, and never with such specific legal citations. Diana's reference to People v. Kelly was not only accurate but demonstrated knowledge of complex legal precedent that extended far beyond any compliance analyst's training. Harper Voss was now sitting rigidly upright, her earlier confidence replaced by visible tension. She leaned toward her legal team, whispering urgent instructions that sent Sloan Mackenzie scrambling through case files. Ms. Reeves, Judge Thornfield said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, you will not instruct this court on legal matters. You are here to answer questions about filing systems and data entry, nothing more. Actually, Your Honor, Diana replied, maintaining her composed demeanor, I'm here to provide testimony regarding systematic violations of federal employment law. The court records show that my testimony was specifically requested regarding compliance analysis, not administrative duties. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a document. According to the witness summons filed under case number CV 2024-7851, Section 4 specifically requests testimony regarding analysis of employment practices and compliance protocols. This falls clearly within my area of expertise. The document she held up was an official court summons, but her ability to cite the specific case number and section from memory was unprecedented. Most witnesses required legal counsel to help them understand their summons, yet Diana was quoting it verbatim. Gage Morton shifted position near the courtroom entrance, his hand moving unconsciously toward his jacket. The security chief's training had taught him to recognize potential threats, and Diana's unusual composure under pressure was triggering his professional instincts. Sloan Mackenzie stood again, her voice carrying a note of desperation that had been absent earlier. Your Honor, this witness is clearly coaching herself from prepared notes. I move to exclude her testimony on the grounds that she's not testifying from personal knowledge, but from rehearsed legal arguments. I object to that characterization, Diana said before anyone else could speak. Federal Rules of Evidence Rule 601 permits witnesses to refresh their recollection using any writing or object. However, my testimony is based on direct personal observation and analysis, not notes or prepared statements. Judge Thornfield slammed his gavel with enough force to make several jurors jump. That is enough. Ms. Reeves, you will answer questions as asked and refrain from legal commentary, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Diana looked directly at the judge, her expression unchanged. Your Honor, I understand your concerns about courtroom procedure. However, threatening a witness with contempt for providing legally accurate testimony could constitute judicial misconduct under California Code of Judicial Ethics Canon 3B7. The silence that followed was deafening. Diana had not only refused to be intimidated but had directly cited judicial ethics rules that could subject Thornfield to disciplinary action. Her knowledge of both evidence law and judicial conduct standards suggested legal training that extended far beyond any corporate compliance role. Marcus Sterling was now taking notes furiously, his earlier casual interest replaced by intense focus. As a prosecutor, he recognized the signs of someone with extensive legal background, and Diana's performance was unlike anything he had witnessed from civilian witnesses. Tessa Hartwell seized the moment of confusion to press forward. Ms. Reeves, please describe your analysis of Meridian Technologies' employment practices. Over a 36-month period, Diana began, I documented a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior affecting minority employees. Specifically, I identified 137 instances where qualified minority candidates were passed over for promotion in favor of less qualified white candidates. Objection, Sloan Mackenzie shouted. Speculation and conclusions, not supported by evidence. The analysis is based on documented personnel files, performance evaluations, and promotion records, Diana continued without pause. Each instance was verified through multiple data sources and cross-referenced with Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission guidelines. Her response demonstrated familiarity with EEOC procedures that went well beyond typical corporate compliance training. Most employees knew their company had to follow equal opportunity rules, but few could cite specific EEOC guidelines or describe proper documentation procedures. Judge Thornfield was visibly struggling to maintain control of the proceedings. Diana's legal knowledge was making it impossible to dismiss her testimony through procedural objections, and her calm demeanor was highlighting his own increasingly erratic behavior. The transformation of the courtroom's atmosphere was palpable as Diana's testimony continued. What had begun as a routine discrimination case was evolving into something far more complex, and the traditional power dynamics that govern such proceedings were starting to shift in ways that made the establishment figures increasingly uncomfortable. Harper Voss stood abruptly from her seat in the gallery and walked toward the courtroom exit, her phone already in her hand. Her departure was not lost on the jury or the legal teams, and her obvious agitation suggested that Diana's testimony was revealing information that Meridian's leadership had hoped to keep buried. "Ms. Reeves," Sloan McKenzie said, approaching the witness stand with renewed aggression, "you claim to have analyzed employment records over a 3-year period. Who gave you authorization to access confidential personnel files?" Diana's response was immediate and precise. "Under Section 703 of the California Labor Code, employees have the right to inspect records relating to their employment. Additionally, compliance analysts require access to employment data to ensure adherence to federal anti-discrimination statutes." "That doesn't answer my question," McKenzie pressed. "Did you have specific written authorization from Human Resources to review confidential employee files?" "I had authorization consistent with my responsibilities for ensuring regulatory compliance. The scope of that authorization is documented in my employment contract and relevant policy memoranda." McKenzie sensed an opportunity. "So you're saying you had written permission? Please produce those documents for the court." Diana paused, her first moment of apparent uncertainty. "The authorization documents are maintained in Meridian's legal compliance files. I don't carry copies of internal policy memoranda." "How convenient," McKenzie said, turning toward the jury with a satisfied smile. "So you're asking this court to accept your testimony about accessing confidential files, but you can't produce any evidence that you were authorized to access those files in the first place." Judge Thornfield leaned forward, seizing the apparent weakness in Diana's testimony. "Ms. Reeves, this court cannot accept claims about document analysis if you cannot demonstrate that you had legitimate access to those documents. Without proper authorization, any analysis you conducted would be inadmissible." Diana remained silent for several seconds, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, not defensiveness, but something approaching amusement. "Your Honor raises an important point about authorization and access to sensitive documents. You're absolutely correct that proper authorization is essential for any legitimate analysis of employment records." She looked directly at Sloan McKenzie. "However, counsel's question assumes that my access to Meridian's employment records was limited to standard employee authorization procedures. That assumption is incorrect." The courtroom fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried a different quality. Diana's tone suggested that she was about to reveal information that would fundamentally change the nature of the proceedings. Marcus Sterling set down his pen and focused entirely on the witness stand. His prosecutorial instincts were telling him that Diana was about to provide information that would elevate this case far beyond a simple employment dispute. "Miss Reeves," Tessa Hartwell said carefully, "could you clarify the nature of your authorization to review employment records?" Diana looked around the courtroom, her gaze settling briefly on each of the major players: Judge Thornfield, Sloan McKenzie, Marcus Sterling, and the jury. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. "My authorization to review employment records extends beyond standard employee privileges. I have been conducting analysis of Meridian Technologies' practices as part of an ongoing federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations in the technology sector." The courtroom erupted. Jurors looked at each other in confusion. Reporters in the press section began typing frantically, and Sloan McKenzie appeared to stumble slightly as she processed Diana's revelation. "Objection!" McKenzie shouted over the noise. "This is completely outside the scope of this witness's previous testimony. She's now claiming to be involved in some kind of federal investigation that has nothing to do with this employment case." Judge Thornfield was hammering his gavel, but the noise in the courtroom was overwhelming. "Order! Order in my courtroom!" Diana waited for the commotion to subside, then continued in the same measured tone. "The investigation encompasses multiple technology companies operating government contracts in California. Meridian Technologies is one of several entities under federal scrutiny for potential violations of civil rights statutes. Gage Morton was now standing near the courtroom door, his hand inside his jacket. The security chief's military background had taught him to recognize situations that were spiraling beyond normal parameters, and Diana's revelations suggested that this case involved federal law enforcement interest. "Your Honor," Sloan Mackenzie said, her voice now carrying genuine alarm, "I move for an immediate recess. This witness is making claims about federal investigations that go far beyond the scope of this employment case. The defense needs time to research these allegations." Judge Thornfield was clearly struggling to process the implications of Diana's testimony. If she was telling the truth about federal investigation, his handling of the case could come under scrutiny from agencies with far more authority than the California state court system. "Ms. Reeves," he said carefully, "are you claiming to be a federal employee?" Diana's pause lasted exactly 5 seconds, long enough to build tension, but not so long as to appear evasive. "I am not at liberty to discuss the specific nature of my employment or the scope of ongoing federal investigations, Your Honor. However, I can confirm that my analysis of Meridian's employment practices has been conducted with appropriate federal authorization." Marcus Sterling was now taking notes with the intensity of someone who realized he might be witnessing the beginning of a major federal case. As a prosecutor, he understood that federal investigations often remained hidden until they were ready to surface, and Diana's testimony suggested that Meridian Technologies might be facing far more serious legal exposure than anyone had realized. This is what happens when prejudice meets justice head-on. Diana's calm composure in the face of such blatant disrespect shows the kind of strength that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. If this story is making your heart race, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started with the most satisfying reveal you've ever seen. Harper Voss returned to the courtroom during Diana's explanation about federal authorization, her face pale and her earlier confidence completely gone. She took her seat behind the defense table and immediately began whispering urgent instructions to her legal team. Sloan Mackenzie regrouped and launched a new attack. "Ms. Reeves, if you're claiming federal authorization for your activities, surely you can provide some documentation of that authorization. A badge, identification, or official credentials?" Diana's response was carefully measured. "Counsel, I'm sure you understand that federal investigations often require confidentiality to protect ongoing operations. Revealing specific details about authorization or methodology could compromise active cases." "That's very convenient," Mackenzie shot back. "So you want this court to accept your testimony about federal investigations, but you won't provide any proof that these investigations actually exist?" "The existence of federal civil rights investigations in the technology sector is a matter of public record," Diana replied. "The Department of Justice has issued multiple press releases regarding increased scrutiny of employment practices in companies holding government contracts." Her reference to DOJ press releases was accurate. The federal government had indeed announced increased attention to civil rights enforcement in the tech sector. However, her knowledge of specific Department of Justice communications suggested access to information that went well beyond what most corporate employees would possess. Judge Thornfield was now visibly sweating despite the courtroom's air conditioning. The possibility that his handling of this case was being monitored by federal authorities was clearly weighing on him, and his earlier confidence was being replaced by obvious anxiety. "Ms. Reeves," he said, his voice noticeably less authoritative than earlier, "this court needs to understand the scope of your involvement in any federal matters. Are you testifying today as a private citizen or in some official capacity?" Diana looked directly at the judge, her expression revealing nothing. "Your Honor, I am testifying as someone with direct knowledge of systematic discrimination at Meridian Technologies. The source of that knowledge and the context in which it was obtained are separate matters that may not be appropriate for discussion in this forum." The careful phrasing of her response was lost on no one. Diana was neither confirming nor denying federal involvement, but she was making it clear that there were aspects of her testimony that extended beyond the immediate scope of the employment case. Marcus Sterling stood up from his position near the prosecution table. "Your Honor, if I may, the District Attorney's Office has been monitoring this case due to potential criminal implications related to civil rights violations. If this witness has information relevant to federal investigations, it might be appropriate to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office before proceeding." His statement sent a new wave of shock through the courtroom. Sterling's suggestion that criminal charges might be involved elevated the stakes dramatically, and his reference to the U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed that federal authorities were indeed paying attention to the proceedings. Sloane Mackenzie was now consulting frantically with her colleagues, their hushed conversations betraying the panic that was beginning to set in among Meridian's defenders. The carefully orchestrated legal strategy that had been working so effectively was crumbling in the face of Diana's revelations about federal involvement. Gage Morton left his position near the door and approached Harper Voss, bending down to whisper something in her ear. Her reaction, a sharp intake of breath and a quick glance toward the witness stand, suggested that Meridian's security chief was recognizing patterns that troubled his professional instincts. "Your Honor," Tessa Hartwell said, seizing the momentum shift, "I believe Ms. Reeves's testimony demonstrates that this case involves issues of national significance. The systematic discrimination she has documented may violate not only state employment law but federal civil rights statutes with criminal implications." Judge Thornfield was clearly out of his depth. The routine employment case he had expected to dismiss quickly was transforming into something that could attract federal scrutiny of his own conduct. His earlier cavalier treatment of the proceedings was now looking like a potential career-ending mistake. "I'm going to call a 30-minute recess," he announced, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "All parties will remain in the building. Court personnel, please ensure that all witnesses are available for immediate return to testimony." As the courtroom began to empty, Diana remained seated in the witness stand, her composure unchanged despite the chaos her testimony had created. She appeared to be waiting for something, or someone, though her expression gave no indication of what that might be. When facing corruption or workplace discrimination, having legal protection can make all the difference. MetLife Legal Plans gives you access to experienced attorneys for employment issues, civil rights violations, and workplace harassment cases. For less than $1 a day, you get unlimited consultations and representation when you need it most. Don't face injustice alone. Get MetLife Legal Plans and have a team of professionals fighting for your rights. During the recess, several significant developments occurred simultaneously. Harper Voss was observed making multiple phone calls from the courthouse parking lot, her conversations apparently urgent and heated. Sloane Mackenzie huddled with her legal team in an empty conference room, their discussion punctuated by frequent references to federal investigation procedures and criminal liability. Meanwhile, Marcus Sterling used the break to place his own call to the U.S. Attorney's office. His conversation was brief but intense, and when he returned to the courtroom, his demeanor suggested that he had received confirmation of something significant. The courthouse hallways buzzed with speculation from reporters and observers who recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Employment discrimination cases rarely generated the kind of tension that was now permeating the building, and Diana's references to federal investigations had transformed the proceedings into a potential national story. When court reconvened, Judge Thornfield appeared to have regained some composure, though his earlier arrogance had been replaced by obvious caution. "Ms. Reeves, before we continue with your testimony, I want to clarify the scope of your knowledge and involvement. Are you currently employed by any federal agency?" Diana's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Your Honor, I am not at liberty to discuss my current employment status or any ongoing federal matters that might relate to this case. However, I can continue to provide testimony about my observations regarding discriminatory practices at Meridian Technologies." The careful parsing of her words was becoming a pattern. Diana was consistently refusing to confirm or deny federal employment, while making it clear that there were limits to what she could reveal in the current forum. Sloane Mackenzie stood for what would prove to be her final attempt to discredit Diana's testimony. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly evading direct questions about her background and authority. She claims to have conducted analysis as part of federal investigations but won't provide any documentation or proof of that authority. This court cannot accept such vague claims about federal involvement without concrete evidence." Diana looked at Mackenzie with something approaching sympathy. "Counsel raises valid points about documentation and proof. You're absolutely correct that extraordinary claims require substantial evidence." She paused, her hands moving to the inside pocket of her jacket. "However, your assumption that I cannot provide documentation is incorrect." The courtroom held its collective breath as Diana withdrew a slim black leather wallet. Unlike the simple notebook she had consulted earlier, this item had the unmistakable appearance of official credentials. "Given the questions raised about my authority to conduct this analysis, and considering the potential impact on ongoing federal investigations, I believe the time has come for full disclosure." Diana stood from the witness chair and walked to the court reporter's station. With deliberate precision, she opened the leather wallet and held it directly in front of the court stenographer's machine. "For the record, my name is Diana Reeves. I serve as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right now, Judge Thornfield thinks he's won. He has no idea that every word he's spoken has been recorded by federal investigators. The evidence is about to come crashing down, And when it does, it's going to change everything. Don't miss what happens next. This is where justice finally gets served cold. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical force. The collective gasp was audible even over the sound of reporters frantically typing and phones buzzing with urgent calls. Judge Thornfield's face went completely white, while Sloane Mackenzie appeared to lose her balance and had to grip the defense table for support. Diana held her FBI director credentials in a position where the court stenographer could read every detail clearly. The official seal, the federal identification number, and her photograph were all visible as she spoke in the same measured tone she had maintained throughout her testimony. I have been conducting a comprehensive investigation into systematic corruption and civil rights violations in California's technology sector. Operation Circuit Breaker has been active for 18 months, during which time my agents and I have documented extensive evidence of criminal conspiracies involving corporate executives, public officials, and members of the legal community. She turned to face Judge Thornfield directly. Your Honor, you are currently the subject of a federal investigation for conspiracy to obstruct justice, acceptance of bribes, and multiple violations of federal civil rights statutes. This proceeding has been monitored and recorded by federal agents since its inception this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over her machine as she processed the magnitude of what was unfolding. Marcus Sterling was the first to recover his composure. As a prosecutor, he understood that he was witnessing the culmination of a major federal operation and his role required immediate action. Your Honor, he said, standing at his table, the district attorney's office has been cooperating with federal authorities in this matter. I have been instructed to facilitate any actions deemed necessary by Director Reeves and her team. Judge Thornfield tried to speak but managed only a choking sound. The transformation from powerful authority figure to criminal defendant was happening in real time, and his mind was clearly struggling to process the reversal. Sloane Mackenzie had managed to regain her footing, but her face remained ashen. This is impossible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't just walk into a courtroom and claim to be the FBI director. This has to be some kind of elaborate hoax. Diana returned to the witness stand but remained standing. Her posture had subtly changed. The deferential positioning of a witness had been replaced by the authoritative bearing of a federal law enforcement executive. Ms. Mackenzie, I understand your shock and skepticism. However, I can assure you that my credentials are authentic and that this operation has been coordinated with the highest levels of federal law enforcement. She gestured toward the courtroom's main entrance. Agent Martinez and Agent Thompson have been positioned in this building since 7 a.m. this morning, monitoring these proceedings and coordinating with U.S. Marshal Service personnel who are prepared to execute federal warrants as soon as I provide the authorization. As if summoned by her words, two individuals who had been sitting in the back row of the gallery stood simultaneously. They were tall, fit, and their faces carried the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. One of them, a Latino man in a dark suit, approached the bench while displaying his own credentials. Agent Carlos Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced. Your Honor, I'm here to assist Director Reeves with the execution of federal warrants and to coordinate with local law enforcement as needed. The second agent, a woman with short blonde hair, moved toward the defense table. Agent Jennifer Thompson, FBI. Ms. Mackenzie, I need to inform you that you and your client are currently subjects of this federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent and to request legal counsel before answering any questions about your involvement in the activities under investigation. The courtroom was now in complete chaos. Reporters were rushing toward exits to file urgent stories. Gallery members were shouting questions, and court personnel were looking to each other for guidance about how to handle a situation that had no precedent in their experience. Diana raised her hand, and the authority in her gesture was sufficient to quiet the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that these revelations are shocking. However, I want to assure everyone that this operation has been conducted with full respect for legal procedures and civil liberties. She looked around the courtroom, her gaze taking in everyone present. Operation Circuit Breaker has uncovered evidence of a systematic corruption network involving technology companies, judicial officials, and law enforcement personnel throughout California. Today's proceedings represent the public phase of an investigation that has been building evidence for nearly 2 years. Judge Thornfield finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. This can't be happening. I am a sitting judge. You cannot just walk into my courtroom and make these accusations. Diana's response was gentle but implacable. Your Honor, you ceased to be a legitimate judicial authority the moment you accepted bribes to influence legal proceedings. The federal government has extensive evidence of your corruption, including recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. She nodded to Agent Martinez, who approached the bench with a document folder. "These are federal warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery, and violations of civil rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent and to request legal counsel." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent courtroom as Judge Wade Thornfield's 20-year reign of corruption came to an end. The man who had wielded his gavel like a weapon against the powerless was now powerless himself, led away by federal agents who represented a justice system he had betrayed. Harper Voss had attempted to leave during the confusion, but Agent Thompson intercepted her near the exit. "Ms. Voss, you're also named in these federal warrants. Meridian Technologies has been under investigation for conspiracy, bribery, and systematic civil rights violations." Sloan Mackenzie stood frozen at the defense table, her legal mind racing to comprehend the scope of the operation that had just been revealed. Her reputation as one of California's most formidable corporate attorneys was evaporating as she realized that her defense of Meridian had made her complicit in a federal conspiracy. Diana surveyed the transformed courtroom with the satisfaction of someone who had planned this moment for months. The careful revelation of her identity, the positioning of her agents, and the coordination with local authorities had all proceeded exactly as designed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, addressing them directly for the first time, "you have witnessed the culmination of a federal investigation into corruption that has infected our legal and corporate institutions. The evidence you will see in the coming weeks will demonstrate that the discrimination Mr. Johnson and his colleagues experienced was just one symptom of a much larger criminal enterprise." As federal agents continued to execute warrants and coordinate with local law enforcement, Diana remained at the witness stand, ready to answer questions about an investigation that would reshape California's technology sector and restore faith in the principle that no one, not corporate executives, not prosecutors, and certainly not judges, was above the law. The courtroom that had begun the day as Judge Thornfield's kingdom had become the stage for his downfall, and the quiet woman he had mocked as a glorified secretary had revealed herself as the architect of his destruction. Justice had not just been served. It had been delivered with the full force and authority of the federal government. The transformation of the Riverside County Superior Court from a routine civil proceeding to the epicenter of a major federal operation was swift and methodical. As Judge Wade Thornfield was led away in handcuffs, his courthouse kingdom dissolved around him with the efficiency of a well-orchestrated law enforcement action that had been months in the planning. Diana Reeves remains at the witness stand, no longer the humble administrative employee who had walked into the building that morning. The revelation of her true identity as FBI director had stripped away all pretense, revealing the calculated precision with which she had orchestrated this moment. Every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every seemingly defensive response had been designed to draw out the corruption network's key players and document their crimes in real time. Agent Carlos Martinez approached the bench where Judge Thornfield had been sitting, his movements deliberate and professional. From a briefcase that had been positioned near the gallery entrance since early morning, he withdrew a thick folder containing documentation that would reshape the understanding of corruption in California's legal system. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Reeves announced, her voice carrying the authority that had been carefully concealed throughout the morning, "what you have witnessed today represents the public culmination of Operation Circuit Breaker, an 18-month federal investigation into systematic corruption affecting multiple sectors of California's government and business communities." She gestured toward Agent Martinez, who was now arranging documents on the judge's abandoned desk. "The evidence we will present demonstrates that the discrimination case you thought you were observing was actually the final phase of a complex federal sting operation designed to expose criminal conspiracies that have been operating for more than a decade." Sloan Mackenzie stood frozen at the defense table, her legal mind struggling to process the implications of what was unfolding around her. As one of California's most prominent corporate attorneys, she had built her reputation on anticipating and neutralizing legal threats against her clients. The possibility that she had been unknowingly participating in a federal investigation while believing she was conducting routine litigation defense represented a professional catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. "Agent Thompson," Director Reeves said, addressing the blonde woman who had been monitoring Harper Voss, "please begin documentation of the evidence seizure protocols. We'll need complete chain of custody records for all materials gathered during this operation." Agent Jennifer Thompson nodded and activated a small recording device. "Federal Bureau of Investigation Evidence Log, Operation Circuit Breaker, Phase 3 Conclusion. Location, Riverside County Superior Court, Courtroom 3B. Time, 3:27 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Present, Director Diana Reeves, Agent Carlos Martinez, Agent Jennifer Thompson, and civilian witnesses as noted in attached documentation. The methodical professionalism of the federal agents created a stark contrast to the chaos that had characterized the courtroom just minutes earlier. Where Judge Thornfield had ruled through intimidation and arbitrary authority, the FBI operation proceeded with the measured precision of officers who understood that every action would be scrutinized by federal prosecutors and defense attorneys in the months to come. Tessa Hartwell, the plaintiff's attorney whose discrimination case had provided cover for the federal investigation, approached Director Reeves with obvious bewilderment. "Director, I need to understand what just happened here. Was my client's case real? Or was this entire proceeding some kind of elaborate setup?" Director Reeves turned toward Hartwell, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Hartwell, I want to assure you that Mr. Johnson's discrimination case is absolutely legitimate and that the evidence of systematic bias at Meridian Technologies is completely accurate. Your client and the other affected employees are genuine victims of corporate discrimination that violates both state and federal civil rights laws." She paused, allowing the courtroom to absorb this confirmation. "However, the scope of criminal activity we uncovered during our investigation extends far beyond employment discrimination. Meridian Technologies has been operating as part of a corruption network that includes judicial officials, law enforcement personnel, and government contractors throughout Southern California." Malik Johnson, the lead plaintiff in the discrimination case, had been sitting in stunned silence since the FBI revelation began. As a software engineer who had simply sought justice for workplace bias, he was struggling to comprehend that his legal complaint had become the centerpiece of a major federal investigation. "Mr. Johnson," Director Reeves said, addressing him directly, "I want you to understand that your courage in coming forward with evidence of discrimination was instrumental in exposing this broader criminal conspiracy. Without the documentation you provided and the credible testimony you gave, we would not have been able to build the comprehensive case that led to today's arrests." Marcus Sterling, the deputy district attorney who had been monitoring the proceedings, stepped forward to address the confusion that was evident among the remaining courtroom occupants. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office has been cooperating with federal authorities in this investigation for the past 6 months. The state-level criminal charges that will result from today's evidence will be prosecuted in coordination with federal authorities." The scope of the conspiracy was beginning to emerge as Agent Martinez completed his arrangement of evidence documents. The papers spread across the judge's desk represented thousands of hours of investigative work, including financial records, communications intercepts, surveillance footage, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who had been secretly working with federal authorities for months. Understanding your legal rights is the first step to protecting yourself from corruption and discrimination. Masterclass offers courses taught by renowned civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors, and legal experts who share real-world strategies for navigating complex legal situations. Learn from the best minds in law and justice. Sign up for Masterclass today and get unlimited access to over 180 classes that could change your perspective on law and advocacy. Director Reeves moved from the witness stand to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself where everyone present could see and hear her clearly. The commanding presence she now displayed was the result of decades of law enforcement experience, including 15 years with the FBI and 3 years as director of the nation's premier federal investigative agency. Operation Circuit Breaker was initiated after the Department of Justice received credible intelligence regarding systematic corruption in California's technology sector, she began, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Our investigation revealed that several major government contractors were engaging in discriminatory practices while simultaneously bribing public officials to ensure continued access to lucrative federal contracts." She gestured toward the evidence that Agent Martinez had arranged. "The financial records we have compiled show that Meridian Technologies paid more than $3.2 million in bribes to judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials over a 7-year period. These payments were disguised as consulting fees, charitable contributions, and investment opportunities, but they were actually systematic corruption designed to ensure favorable treatment in legal proceedings." The figure sent a ripple of shock through the remaining courtroom observers. $3.2 million represented a level of corruption that extended far beyond simple workplace discrimination, suggesting a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years. Harper Voss, the Meridian Technologies CEO, who was now in federal custody, had been instrumental in creating this corruption network. Her company's rapid growth from a small startup to a major government contractor had been facilitated by a systematic campaign of bribery that ensured Meridian received favorable treatment in contract competitions, regulatory reviews, and legal disputes. Ms. Voss, Director Reeves continued, established what she called her relationship investment strategy in 2017. This strategy involved identifying key public officials who could influence decisions affecting Meridian's business interests, then providing them with financial benefits designed to ensure their cooperation. Agent Thompson activated a laptop computer that had been connected to the courtroom's audio system. We have recorded conversations between Ms. Voss and Judge Thornfield discussing specific cases and the payments required to ensure favorable outcomes. These recordings were obtained through federal wiretaps authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The mention of FISA court authorization indicated that the investigation had involved national security considerations. Meridian Technologies' government contracts included surveillance software used by federal law enforcement agencies, raising the possibility that corporate corruption had compromised sensitive government operations. The first recording began to play, and Judge Thornfield's voice filled the courtroom with damning clarity. The conversation had been recorded 3 months earlier in his private chambers, and it revealed the casual manner in which he discussed selling judicial decisions. "Harper, the Johnson case is going to require some careful handling," Thornfield's voice said through the speakers. "The plaintiff has decent evidence, and if this goes to a jury, there's a real risk they'll find for the employee. That could set a precedent that affects other tech companies." Harper Voss's response was equally incriminating. "Wade, we've discussed this before. Meridian cannot afford to lose this case. The precedent issue is exactly why we need your help. What will it take to ensure the right outcome?" "The usual arrangement should suffice," Thornfield replied. $200,000 to the Judicial Excellence Foundation plus the consulting contract for Patricia's law firm. That should cover the exposure. The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting the detailed negotiation of bribes in exchange for predetermined case outcomes. The casual tone of the conversation suggested that such arrangements were routine between Thornfield and Voss, representing a systematic pattern of corruption rather than an isolated incident. As the recording concluded, Agent Martinez began presenting financial documents that corroborated the bribery discussions. Bank records showed transfers from Meridian subsidiaries to accounts controlled by Judge Thornfield's family members, with timing that corresponded precisely to favorable rulings in cases involving Meridian's interests. The Judicial Excellence Foundation referenced in that conversation, Director Reeves explained, was a shell organization created specifically to launder bribery payments. Judge Thornfield established the foundation as a charitable entity, but our investigation revealed that 100% of its funding came from companies with cases pending in his court. The sophistication of the money laundering operation demonstrated that the corruption network had been carefully planned and professionally executed. Rather than simple cash payments that could be easily detected, the conspirators had created an elaborate system of shell organizations, charitable foundations, and consulting contracts designed to disguise the true nature of their financial relationships. Sloan Mackenzie, who had remained silent during the evidence presentation, finally found her voice. "Director Reeves, are you alleging that I was knowingly participating in this conspiracy? I want to make absolutely clear that I had no knowledge of any bribery or corruption involving my client." Director Reeves studied Mackenzie carefully before responding. "Ms. Mackenzie, our investigation indicates that your participation in this conspiracy was knowing and deliberate. We have evidence showing that you were aware of the financial arrangements between Meridian and Judge Thornfield, and that you coordinated your legal strategies with the expectation that the court would rule in your favor regardless of the evidence presented." She nodded to Agent Thompson, who activated a second recording. "This conversation was recorded 4 weeks ago in your law firm's conference room during a strategy meeting with Meridian's executive team." Mackenzie's voice emerged from the speakers with devastating clarity. "Judge Thornfield has been extremely cooperative on corporate matters, and I don't anticipate any problems with the Johnson case. The key is to present enough of a defense to make the outcome look legitimate. But we don't need to worry about actually winning on the merits." The recording continued with Mackenzie discussing specific strategies for managing witnesses and evidence in a manner that assumed the case outcome had been predetermined. Her references to maintaining appearances and legitimate-looking procedures demonstrated clear awareness that the legal proceeding was being manipulated through corrupt arrangements. "I also want to address the role of Marcus Sterling and the district attorney's office," Director Reeves said, turning toward the prosecutor who had been monitoring the proceedings. "Mr. Sterling has been serving as a confidential informant for federal authorities since January of this year, providing intelligence about corruption within the local legal community." This revelation sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Sterling's presence at civil proceedings had seemed unusual, but his role as an FBI informant explained both his interest in the case and his apparent foreknowledge of the federal operation that was about to unfold. The district attorney's office first contacted federal authorities when they became concerned about irregularities in criminal cases involving Meridian Technologies employees, Sterling explained. We noticed that charges against Meridian executives were being consistently reduced or dismissed, often through plea agreements that seemed inconsistent with the evidence. He approached the evidence table where Agent Martinez had arranged the corruption documentation. Our cooperation with the FBI allowed us to document the flow of money from Meridian to various officials, and to identify the scope of the conspiracy that extended throughout the local legal system. The breadth of the corruption network was staggering. Beyond Judge Thornfield and the immediate players in the courtroom, Operation Circuit Breaker had identified 17 other public officials who had received payments from Meridian Technologies in exchange for favorable treatment. The list included 3 additional judges, 2 prosecutors, 4 law enforcement officials, and 8 regulatory personnel who had oversight responsibilities for government contractors. Director Reeves gestured toward a wall chart that Agent Thompson was now displaying. The chart showed the interconnected relationships between corrupt officials, with lines indicating financial flows and coordination of activities. At the center of the network was Harper Voss, whose systematic cultivation of corrupt relationships had enabled Meridian to operate with virtual impunity for years. The ultimate scope of this conspiracy extends beyond simple bribery, Director Reeves continued. Meridian Technologies has been using its privileged access to government surveillance systems to conduct unauthorized monitoring of potential competitors, critics, and regulatory investigators. This represents a violation of federal computer fraud statutes and potentially constitutes domestic espionage. The national security implications of the conspiracy were becoming clear. Meridian's contracts with federal law enforcement agencies had provided the company with access to sensitive surveillance capabilities that were being misused for corporate advantage. This represented not just corruption but a fundamental breach of the trust that governs relationships between private contractors and national security agencies. Agent Martinez activated a laptop computer that displayed intercepted communications between Meridian executives and foreign business partners. Our investigation also revealed that Ms. Voss was negotiating to sell modified versions of government surveillance software to international clients, including some that are subject to federal sanctions. The evidence showed detailed discussions about adapting software developed for U.S. law enforcement agencies for use by authoritarian governments seeking to monitor their own populations. The potential sale of such technology represented violations of export control laws and sanctions regimes that could have resulted in charges of treason or sedition. This brings us to the question of sentencing and outcomes, Director Reeves said, addressing the practical implications of the investigation's conclusions. The federal charges that will result from this investigation carry significant prison sentences, but I want to be realistic about the likely outcomes of federal prosecution. She paused to ensure that everyone in the courtroom understood the gravity of what she was about to explain. Judge Thornfield will face federal charges including conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery, and violations of civil rights under color of law. These charges carry a combined maximum sentence of 45 years in federal prison. However, given his age, health condition, and potential cooperation with ongoing investigations, he will likely receive a sentence in the range of 12 to 18 years. The realistic assessment of sentencing reflected the pragmatic approach that federal prosecutors took toward high-profile corruption cases. While the maximum penalties were severe, actual sentences typically reflected factors such as the defendant's cooperation, age, health, and role in the conspiracy. Harper Voss faces more serious charges including racketeering, money laundering, computer fraud, and violations of export control laws. The combined maximum sentence for these charges exceeds 60 years, but her actual sentence will likely be in the range of 25 to 30 years, depending on her cooperation with federal authorities. The mention of cooperation indicated that federal prosecutors were prepared to offer reduced sentences in exchange for testimony that could be used against other members of the corruption network. This approach was standard in complex conspiracy cases where the goal was to dismantle entire criminal organizations rather than simply punish individual participants. Sloan McKenzie will face charges related to conspiracy and obstruction of justice, with likely sentences in the range of 8 to 12 years. However, if she provides substantial cooperation regarding other corrupt attorneys and the broader legal conspiracy, her sentence could be significantly reduced. If you loved seeing corruption exposed and justice served, wait until you hear our next story about a small-town police chief who thought he was untouchable until a federal prosecutor walked into his precinct. Subscribe and hit that bell icon because these stories of accountability are just getting started. The systematic dismantling of the corruption network would unfold over the coming months as federal prosecutors filed charges and began the complex process of coordinating multiple criminal cases. The evidence gathered during Operation Circuit Breaker was extensive enough to support prosecutions that would continue for several years, ensuring that the full scope of the conspiracy would be exposed through public trial proceedings. However, Director Reeves was careful to manage expectations about the broader systemic changes that would result from the investigation. I want to be clear that while this operation has been successful in identifying and prosecuting specific instances of corruption, the underlying problems that enabled this conspiracy to operate for so long will require sustained institutional reform efforts. She gestured toward the evidence documentation that filled the judge's desk. The corruption we have exposed reflects broader weaknesses in oversight systems, ethical enforcement mechanisms, and transparency requirements that govern relationships between private contractors and public officials. Addressing these systemic issues will require legislative changes, regulatory reforms, and cultural shifts that extend far beyond individual prosecutions. The realistic assessment of institutional change reflected the FBI's experience with high-profile corruption investigations. While individual prosecutions could remove specific bad actors from positions of power, creating lasting institutional change required broader political and social transformation that could take decades to achieve. Agent Thompson approached the evidence table with an additional folder of documents that had not yet been displayed. Director, we also have the communications intercepts from the encrypted messaging system that Meridian used to coordinate with other technology companies involved in similar corrupt arrangements. This revelation indicated that the Meridian conspiracy was part of a larger pattern of corruption that affected multiple companies and jurisdictions. The encrypted communications suggested a level of coordination between corrupt entities that elevated the conspiracy from a local problem to a regional or even national security concern. The encrypted communications reveal coordination between Meridian Technologies and at least 6 other major government contractors operating in California, Texas, and Virginia, Director Reeves explained. These companies were sharing information about corrupt officials, coordinating bribery payments, and dividing market territories to ensure that their collective corruption activities did not create conflicts that might attract law enforcement attention. The multi-state scope of the corruption network meant that prosecution efforts would require coordination between federal districts and potentially involve the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, which specialized in cases involving government corruption and national security implications. Marcus Sterling stepped forward to address the immediate practical implications for ongoing legal proceedings in Riverside County. The district attorney's office has identified 47 criminal cases that were potentially affected by Judge Thornfield's corrupt arrangements with various defendants. We will be reviewing each of these cases to determine whether convictions were obtained through corrupt means that require overturning. The potential reversal of dozens of criminal convictions represented a massive disruption to the local legal system. Defense attorneys would undoubtedly file appeals claiming that their clients' cases had been tainted by judicial corruption, while prosecutors would face the difficult task of retrying cases where evidence might no longer be available. Additionally, Sterling continued, we have identified 19 civil cases where Judge Thornfield's corrupt arrangements may have affected outcomes. The parties in these cases will have grounds for appealing judgments that were obtained through bribery rather than legitimate legal proceedings. The civil implications were equally complex. Companies that had lost cases to Meridian or other corrupt entities would likely file lawsuits seeking damages for losses that resulted from corrupted judicial proceedings. These secondary lawsuits could continue for years and involve damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Director Reeves recognized that the courtroom audience was struggling to comprehend the full scope of what had been revealed. The investigation had uncovered layers of corruption that extended far beyond the simple employment discrimination case that had provided the initial pretext for federal involvement. I understand that the scale of this conspiracy is difficult to process, she said, addressing the reporters, court personnel, and remaining gallery members. Operation Circuit Breaker represents one of the largest public corruption investigations in California's history, and the evidence we have gathered documents criminal activity spanning more than a decade. She moved toward the courtroom exit, signaling that the formal evidence presentation was concluding. Federal prosecutors will be filing initial charges within 72 hours, and we expect additional indictments to be announced over the coming months as the investigation continues to develop. Agent Martinez began collecting the evidence documents, following careful chain of custody protocols that would ensure their admissibility in subsequent federal trials. The meticulous documentation of every piece of evidence reflected the FBI's understanding that defense attorneys would challenge every aspect of the investigation in an effort to protect their clients. As the federal agents prepared to leave the courthouse, the full transformation of the day's events became clear. What had begun as a routine employment discrimination hearing had evolved into the public revelation of a massive corruption investigation that would reshape California's legal and business communities. The courtroom that Judge Thornfield had controlled through intimidation and corrupt arrangements was now empty except for the evidence of his crimes. The gavel that he had used to silence opposition witnesses sat abandoned on his desk, a symbol of authority that had been corrupted beyond redemption. Tessa Hartwell approached Director Reeves as the FBI team prepared to depart. "Director, what happens to my clients now? They filed this lawsuit seeking justice for workplace discrimination. And while I'm grateful that this broader corruption has been exposed, they still need resolution of their employment claims." Director Reeves paused at the courtroom door. "Ms. Hartwell, your client's discrimination case will proceed, but it will now be heard by a federal judge rather than in state court. Given the evidence of systematic discrimination that we have documented as part of this investigation, I expect your clients will receive both monetary damages and injunctive relief that will require Meridian to fundamentally change its employment practices." The transfer to federal court represented a significant advantage for the discrimination victims. Federal judges typically had more experience with complex civil rights cases, and the evidence gathered during the FBI investigation would provide comprehensive documentation of Meridian's discriminatory practices. Additionally, Director Reeves continued, the federal government will likely seek to bar Meridian Technologies from future government contracts until the company demonstrates substantial reforms to its employment and business practices. This will create additional pressure for the company to reach a comprehensive settlement with your clients. The possibility of losing government contracts represented an existential threat to Meridian's business model. The company derived more than 70% of its revenue from federal law enforcement agencies, and exclusion from government contracting would likely force bankruptcy or sale to competitors with cleaner compliance records. As the courtroom finally emptied, Marcus Sterling remained behind to coordinate with courthouse security about the preservation of evidence and the documentation of the day's extraordinary proceedings. The transformation of a routine civil case into a major federal corruption investigation would require careful documentation to ensure that the legal system could process the implications appropriately. The hallways of the Riverside County Courthouse buzzed with activity as reporters filed urgent stories about the FBI operation. Attorneys called clients to discuss the implications for pending cases, and courthouse personnel struggled to understand how their familiar legal environment had been compromised by years of systematic corruption. Outside the courthouse, news vans were arriving as national media outlets recognized the significance of the story. The arrest of a sitting judge, the revelation of a multi-million-dollar corruption conspiracy, and the involvement of the FBI director herself created a story that would dominate news coverage for weeks to come. Director Reeves emerged from the courthouse into the glare of television cameras and the shouts of reporters seeking immediate comment on the investigation. Her response was measured and professional, reflecting her experience in managing high-profile federal operations. Operation Circuit Breaker represents the FBI's commitment to investigating corruption wherever it occurs, regardless of the position or influence of those involved, she said, addressing the assembled media. No one is above the law, and today's arrests demonstrate that federal authorities will pursue criminal conspiracies even when they involve respected members of the legal and business communities. She declined to answer specific questions about ongoing aspects of the investigation, citing the need to protect the integrity of federal prosecutions that would unfold over the coming months. However, her presence at the courthouse and her direct involvement in the arrests sent a clear message about the priority that federal authorities placed on public corruption investigations. The drive back to FBI headquarters in Los Angeles gave Director Reeves an opportunity to reflect on the 18 months of investigative work that had culminated in the day's arrests. Operation Circuit Breaker had required unprecedented coordination between federal agencies, state authorities, and local law enforcement organizations, all while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent the corruption network from discovering the investigation and destroying evidence. The decision to have the FBI director personally participate in the arrests was unusual but strategically important. Her presence demonstrated the highest levels of federal commitment to the investigation and ensured that the arrests would receive national attention that might deter similar corruption in other jurisdictions. Agent Martinez, who was driving the federal vehicle, glanced at Director Reeves in the rearview mirror. "Director, the initial press reaction seems very positive. The Justice Department's Public Affairs Office is already receiving requests for interviews from national news outlets. Director Reeves nodded but remained focused on the substantial work that lay ahead. The arrests were the easy part, Carlos. Now we have to build prosecutable cases that will withstand aggressive defense challenges and result in convictions that send a clear message about the consequences of public corruption. The evidence gathered during Operation Circuit Breaker was extensive, but transforming that evidence into successful prosecutions would require months of additional work. Federal prosecutors would need to organize thousands of documents, prepare dozens of witnesses, and anticipate defense strategies designed to challenge every aspect of the government's case. Back at the Riverside County Courthouse, court administrators were beginning the complex process of reviewing Judge Thornfield's caseload to identify decisions that might have been influenced by corrupt arrangements. The administrative burden was staggering, as the judge had handled more than 2,000 cases during his tenure on the bench. Chief Judge Patricia Davidson, who had been monitoring the federal investigation from her chambers, called an emergency meeting of the county's Judicial Council to address the immediate implications of Thornfield's arrest. The revelation that one of their colleagues had been systematically corrupt for years raised questions about the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent such behavior. The reputation of our entire judicial system has been damaged by Judge Thornfield's criminal conduct, Chief Judge Davidson announced to her assembled colleagues. We need to implement immediate reforms that will restore public confidence in the integrity of our courts. The proposed reforms included enhanced financial disclosure requirements for judges, mandatory ethics training, and improved systems for monitoring relationships between judicial officials and the attorneys and litigants who appeared before them. However, the effectiveness of such measures would depend on implementation and enforcement mechanisms that had previously failed to detect Thornfield's corruption. Meanwhile, at Meridian Technologies headquarters in San Jose, emergency board meetings were being convened to address the crisis facing the company. The arrest of CEO Harper Voss and the revelation of systematic corruption had created an immediate threat to the company's survival, as government clients began reviewing their contracts and considering termination options. The company's stock price had fallen 43% in the hours since news of the arrests broke, wiping out more than $2 billion in market value. Institutional investors were demanding immediate management changes and comprehensive compliance reforms as conditions for continued financial support. Legal counsel for Meridian was already developing strategies for managing the federal criminal investigation while attempting to preserve the company's business operations. The complexity of the charges and the extensive evidence gathered by federal authorities suggested that traditional defense approaches would be insufficient to protect the company from serious criminal penalties. The ripple effects of Operation Circuit Breaker extended throughout California's technology sector as other companies with government contracts began reviewing their own compliance programs and political relationships. The comprehensive nature of the federal investigation had created uncertainty about which other companies might be targets of ongoing federal scrutiny. Industry associations representing government contractors issued statements emphasizing their members' commitment to ethical business practices and announcing enhanced compliance initiatives designed to prevent corruption. However, the systematic nature of the Meridian conspiracy suggested that the problems might be more widespread than individual company-level compliance failures. Federal prosecutors in the Central District of California were already preparing for what promised to be one of the most complex public corruption prosecutions in the district's history. The volume of evidence gathered during Operation Circuit Breaker would require teams of prosecutors working for months to organize the material into coherent criminal cases. United States Attorney Elena Rodriguez was personally overseeing the prosecution effort, recognizing that the high-profile nature of the case would attract intense public and media scrutiny. The success or failure of the prosecutions would significantly impact public confidence in federal law enforcement's ability to combat corruption among powerful political and business figures. Operation Circuit Breaker demonstrates the Department of Justice's unwavering commitment to investigating corruption at every level of government and business, Rodriguez announced at a press conference later that evening. The evidence gathered during this investigation will support prosecutions that send a clear message about the consequences of betraying public trust. She outlined the immediate next steps in the federal prosecution process, including the filing of initial charges, arraignment proceedings, and the complex discovery process that would allow defense attorneys to review the government's evidence. The timeline for trials would likely extend into the following year, given the volume of evidence and the number of defendants involved. The investigation had also identified potential violations of federal regulations governing government contractors. leading to separate administrative proceedings that could result in companies being barred from future federal contracts. These administrative sanctions could be imposed much more quickly than criminal penalties and represented immediate consequences for the corrupt behavior. Back in Riverside, the local legal community was struggling to process the implications of having operated within a corrupted system for years. Attorneys who had appeared before Judge Thornfield were reviewing their cases to determine whether their clients might have been affected by the judge's corrupt arrangements with opposing parties. The Riverside County Bar Association called an emergency meeting to address the crisis and develop strategies for restoring confidence in the local legal system. The association's president acknowledged that the corruption scandal would have lasting effects on public perception of the legal profession's integrity. The actions of a few corrupt individuals cannot be allowed to damage the reputation of the thousands of ethical attorneys and judges who serve this community with integrity, the Bar Association president declared. We are committed to implementing reforms that will prevent similar corruption in the future and to supporting efforts to identify and prosecute any other instances of misconduct. However, the practical challenges of implementing meaningful reforms while maintaining the efficiency of the court system would require careful balancing of transparency, oversight, and operational needs. The legal community's response to the corruption scandal would be closely watched by other jurisdictions facing similar challenges. As the first day of the public phase of Operation Circuit Breaker concluded, federal investigators were already preparing for the next phases of their work. The arrests and evidence presentation had achieved the immediate goal of disrupting the corruption network. But the longer-term objective of institutional reform would require sustained effort over many months. Director Reeves reviewed the day's events from her FBI field office, assessing the operation's success against the goals that had been established when the investigation began 18 months earlier. The arrests had proceeded smoothly. The evidence presentation had been comprehensive, and the public reaction had been appropriately outraged by the corruption that had been exposed. However, she recognized that the most important work still lay ahead, converting the evidence into successful prosecutions, supporting institutional reforms, and deterring similar corruption in other jurisdictions would require sustained commitment from federal, state, and local authorities working in coordination. The investigation had also raised broader questions about the systems that allowed corruption to flourish for years without detection. The oversight mechanisms, ethical enforcement procedures, and transparency requirements that were supposed to prevent such behavior had clearly failed in this instance, suggesting the need for fundamental reforms rather than minor adjustments. Agent Thompson prepared the final evidence documentation from the day's arrests, ensuring that every piece of physical evidence, every recorded conversation, and every document would be available for federal prosecutors as they prepared their cases. The meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the investigation would continue through the prosecution phase. Director, Agent Martinez said as he completed his report on the day's operations, the preliminary reaction from other federal districts suggests that Operation Circuit Breaker might encourage similar investigations in other jurisdictions where corruption has been suspected but not previously pursued. Director Reeves nodded, recognizing that the success of the operation could indeed have national implications for federal law enforcement's approach to public corruption investigations. The techniques developed during the investigation and the legal precedents established through subsequent prosecutions could provide templates for addressing similar problems in other communities. As evening approached, the Riverside County Courthouse stood empty and quiet, its familiar routines disrupted by the day's extraordinary events. The courtroom where Judge Thornfield had wielded corrupt authority for years would undergo extensive renovation before returning to service, both to remove the physical reminders of corruption and to install enhanced security and monitoring systems. The judge's gavel remained on his abandoned desk, a symbol of authority that had been perverted beyond redemption. When the courthouse reopened for normal operations, that gavel would be replaced, and new procedures would govern judicial conduct to prevent similar corruption from taking root. The broader implications of Operation Circuit Breaker were still unfolding as legal experts, political analysts, and business leaders attempted to assess the long-term significance of what had been revealed. The systematic nature of the corruption and the high levels of coordination between corrupt actors suggested problems that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior. Academic researchers who studied public corruption recognized that the Meridian case represented a particularly sophisticated form of systematic corruption that might be more common than previously understood. The use of shell organizations, charitable foundations, and consulting contracts to disguise bribery payments demonstrated a level of planning and coordination that suggested professional criminal enterprise rather than opportunistic misconduct. The investigation had also revealed the vulnerability of government contracting systems to corruption when proper oversight mechanisms were not functioning effectively. The ability of a private company to systematically corrupt multiple public officials over an extended period suggested weaknesses in the systems designed to detect and prevent such behavior. Federal agencies responsible for oversight of government contractors were already beginning reviews of their own procedures to identify potential vulnerabilities that might allow similar corruption to occur in their jurisdictions. The lessons learned from Operation Circuit Breaker would likely influence federal contracting policies and oversight procedures for years to come. As the nation's news media continued reporting on the day's dramatic revelations, public attention focused on the broader implications of systematic corruption for democratic institutions and the rule of law. The ability of wealthy private interests to corrupt judicial proceedings raised fundamental questions about equality before the law and the integrity of the justice system. Political leaders from both parties issued statements condemning corruption and calling for enhanced oversight of government operations. However, the practical challenges of implementing meaningful reforms while maintaining operational efficiency would require sustained political commitment that often proved difficult to maintain as public attention moved to other issues. The victims of the corruption, including the Meridian employees who had faced workplace discrimination and the defendants who had received harsher treatment in corrupted criminal proceedings, began organizing to seek compensation for the harm they had suffered. The civil litigation that would result from the corruption revelations would likely continue for years and involve damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Legal scholars noted that the Meridian case demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of federal law enforcement's approach to public corruption. The investigation had successfully identified and disrupted a sophisticated criminal conspiracy, but the corruption had been allowed to operate for years before detection, causing substantial harm that could not be fully remediated through criminal prosecutions. The debate over how to prevent similar corruption in the future would involve fundamental questions about the balance between efficiency and transparency in government operations, the role of private contractors and public services, and the sufficiency of existing oversight mechanisms to detect sophisticated forms of corruption. As the first full day of public awareness of Operation Circuit Breaker drew to a close, the investigation that had begun as a response to employment discrimination complaints had evolved into a comprehensive examination of institutional corruption that would influence legal and political discussions for years to come. Director Reeves returned to FBI headquarters with the satisfaction of having successfully completed a complex investigation, but also with the recognition that the work of repairing the damage caused by systematic corruption would require sustained effort from multiple institutions over an extended period. The arrests were just the beginning of a longer process of accountability and reform. The courthouse in Riverside County stood as a monument to both the corruption that had been exposed and the potential for justice to prevail when law enforcement institutions functioned with integrity and professionalism. The events of this day would be remembered as a turning point in the ongoing struggle between corruption and accountability in American public life. However, even as the immediate crisis was being addressed through arrests and prosecutions, Director Reeves was aware that Operation Circuit Breaker had uncovered evidence of additional corruption networks that were still under investigation. The scope of the problem extended beyond what had been publicly revealed, and federal authorities were continuing to follow leads that might result in future arrests and prosecutions. The encrypted communications that had been intercepted during the investigation contained references to corrupt arrangements in other states and involving other federal contractors. The possibility that the Meridian conspiracy was part of a much larger pattern of corruption would require continued investigation and coordination between federal law enforcement agencies. Agent Martinez submitted his preliminary report on the day's arrests, noting that all primary targets had been successfully apprehended and that evidence preservation protocols had been followed without complications. The professional execution of the arrests would help ensure that defense attorneys would not be able to challenge the prosecutions based on procedural errors during the apprehension phase. Agent Thompson completed her documentation of witness statements and evidence collected during the courtroom proceedings, recognizing that the testimony and physical evidence gathered during the dramatic revelation would be crucial components of the eventual prosecutions. The public nature of many of the admissions made during the proceedings would make them particularly valuable for federal prosecutors. The coordination between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies during Operation Circuit Breaker had proceeded smoothly, demonstrating the potential for effective multi-jurisdictional cooperation in complex corruption investigations. The lessons learned from this coordination would inform future investigations involving similar levels of complexity and political sensitivity. As federal agents completed their immediate post-arrest procedures, the attention of law enforcement officials began shifting toward the next phases of the investigation. The successful disruption of the Meridian corruption network had created opportunities to gather additional evidence about other corrupt arrangements that might have been influenced by fear of exposure. The psychological impact of the arrests on other potentially corrupt officials and business leaders was already becoming apparent through intelligence gathered by federal agents. Several individuals who had been under investigation for related activities had made contact with federal authorities to discuss potential cooperation, suggesting that the dramatic public arrests had encouraged cooperation from previously reluctant witnesses. The strategic decision to conduct the arrests in such a public and dramatic manner had been designed to maximize both the deterrent effect on other potential corruption and the encouragement for victims and witnesses to come forward with additional evidence. The early indications suggested that this strategy was achieving its intended objectives. Federal prosecutors were already receiving calls from attorneys representing individuals who believed they might have information relevant to ongoing corruption investigations. The willingness of potential witnesses to contact federal authorities voluntarily would significantly enhance the government's ability to build comprehensive cases against the remaining targets of investigation. The media coverage of Operation Circuit Breaker had also attracted attention from investigative journalists who were beginning their own research into potential corruption in other jurisdictions. The collaboration between law enforcement and media investigations had historically been an important factor in exposing widespread corruption and encouraging systemic reforms. Academic researchers studying corruption and law enforcement were already analyzing the public information about Operation Circuit Breaker to identify best practices that could be applied to similar investigations in other contexts. The sophisticated investigative techniques and coordination mechanisms that had been employed could provide templates for addressing corruption in different institutional settings. The international implications of the investigation were also becoming apparent as foreign law enforcement agencies expressed interest in the techniques that had been used to investigate complex corruption networks involving private contractors and public officials. The global nature of corruption challenges meant that successful investigative approaches developed in one country often had applications in other jurisdictions. As the immediate crisis management phase of Operation Circuit Breaker concluded, federal authorities began focusing on the longer-term objectives of institutional reform and deterrence that would determine the ultimate success of the investigation. The arrests and prosecutions would be meaningless if the underlying conditions that enabled corruption were not addressed through systematic reforms. Director Reeves concluded her assessment of the day's operation with recognition that Operation Circuit Breaker represented both a significant success for federal law enforcement and a sobering reminder of the persistent challenges posed by corruption in American institutions. The work of building a more transparent and accountable system of governance would require sustained commitment from all levels of government and society. The transformation of the Riverside County Courthouse from a center of corruption to a symbol of accountability would serve as a reminder that the rule of law could prevail over private interests when law enforcement institutions operated with integrity and professionalism. However, maintaining that integrity would require constant vigilance and commitment to the principles of democratic governance. The victims of the corruption that had been exposed would finally have their opportunity for justice, though the legal proceedings required to achieve that justice would be lengthy and complex. The employment discrimination case that had provided the initial pretext for the investigation would proceed in federal court with the full weight of federal civil rights enforcement behind it. The broader implications of Operation Circuit Breaker for American law enforcement and governance would continue to unfold over the months and years to come. The investigation had demonstrated both the potential for sophisticated corruption to compromise important institutions and the capacity of law enforcement to expose and disrupt such corruption when provided with adequate resources and authority. As night fell over Riverside County, the courthouse that had been the center of so much dramatic activity stood quiet and empty, its future uncertain but its immediate crisis resolved. The work of justice would continue in other venues and through other proceedings, but the foundation for accountability had been established through the professional and thorough investigation that had culminated in this day's arrests. The success of Operation Circuit Breaker would be measured not just by the convictions that would result from the arrests, but by the broader institutional changes that might prevent similar corruption from taking root in the future. The true test of the investigation's impact would be whether the dramatic revelations of corruption would translate into lasting reforms that strengthen democratic institutions and the rule of law. However, as Director Reeves prepared her final reports on the day's operations, She was acutely aware that Operation Circuit Breaker had revealed only part of a much larger pattern of corruption that continued to threaten American institutions. The investigation had identified connections to other corruption networks that were still under active investigation, and the full scope of the problem remained unknown. In a secure conference room at FBI headquarters, Director Reeves met with her senior staff to review classified intelligence that had not been revealed during the public arrests. The information contained in these classified files would drive the next phases of federal investigation and would determine whether Operation Circuit Breaker was an isolated success or the beginning of a much larger campaign against systematic corruption. The intelligence we have gathered suggests that the Meridian Network was just one component of a much larger corruption system that extends across multiple states and involves federal agencies we haven't yet identified publicly, Director Reeves explained to her assembled staff. The communications we intercepted contained references to arrangements involving defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and congressional staff members. The scope of the corruption that was still under investigation was staggering in its implications for American governance and national security. The possibility that foreign adversaries might have exploited corrupted government contractors to gain access to sensitive national security information was among the most serious concerns driving continued federal investigation. Agent Martinez presented preliminary analysis of the encrypted communications that had been recovered from Meridian's servers. Director, we've identified at least 12 other companies that appear to have been participating in similar corruption networks. The coordination between these companies suggests a level of systematic planning that goes far beyond what we've seen in previous corruption investigations. The revelation that the corruption might be systematic rather than isolated would require a fundamental reassessment of federal law enforcement's approach to public corruption investigations. The traditional model of investigating individual instances of corruption would be inadequate to address systematic criminal enterprises that spanned multiple jurisdictions and institutions. We're going to need additional resources and authority to investigate the full scope of what we've discovered, Director Reeves concluded. I'll be briefing the Attorney General and the President about the national security implications of this investigation, and we'll need their support for what could become the largest public corruption investigation in American history. The transformation of Operation Circuit Breaker from a regional corruption investigation into a potential national security matter reflected the sophisticated nature of modern corruption networks and their ability to compromise critical government functions. The challenge facing federal law enforcement was ensuring that the investigation could be expanded appropriately while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent the destruction of evidence. As federal agents continued their analysis of the evidence gathered during the day's arrests, they uncovered additional leads that pointed toward corruption in federal agencies that had not previously been suspected. The systematic nature of the corruption suggested that traditional oversight mechanisms had been compromised or bypassed entirely. The classified intelligence that drove the ongoing investigation included communications intercepts that had been authorized under national security authorities, reflecting the government's assessment that the corruption posed threats to national security that justified extraordinary investigative measures. The balance between protecting civil liberties and investigating potential treason would be a continuing challenge throughout the expanded investigation. Director Reeves concluded her briefing with recognition that Operation Circuit Breaker had achieved its immediate objectives while revealing the need for much more extensive federal action. The arrests of Judge Thornfield, Harper Voss, and their co-conspirators represented just the beginning of what might become the defining corruption investigation of the decade. The American people deserve to know the full extent of the corruption that has compromised their government, Director Reeves declared. Operation Circuit Breaker will continue until we have identified and prosecuted everyone who has betrayed the public trust, regardless of their position or influence. The commitment to continued investigation reflected the FBI's recognition that half measures would be insufficient to address the systematic nature of the corruption that had been revealed. The scope and sophistication of the criminal conspiracy required an equally comprehensive and determined law enforcement response. However, as the classified briefing concluded and federal agents returned to their ongoing investigative work, the most disturbing revelation remained unspoken in the public proceedings. The intelligence gathered during Operation Circuit Breaker suggested that some of the corrupted government systems might have been compromised by foreign intelligence services seeking to exploit American governance weaknesses for strategic advantage. The possibility that foreign adversaries had successfully penetrated American government systems through corruption networks added an entirely new dimension to the investigation and raised questions about whether the corruption was simply criminal opportunism or part of more systematic efforts to compromise American democratic institutions. These concerns would drive the classified phases of the investigation that would continue for months beyond the public arrests, as federal authorities worked to determine whether American sovereignty itself had been compromised by the systematic corruption that Operation Circuit Breaker had begun to expose. The courthouse in Riverside County, where the day's dramatic events had unfolded, stood as a symbol of both the vulnerability of democratic institutions to corruption and their capacity for renewal when law enforcement operated with integrity and professionalism. The work of justice would continue, but the foundation for accountability had been established through the courage and dedication of federal agents who refused to accept corruption as an inevitable feature of American governance. The transformation of Diana Reeves from an apparently humble witness to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in American law enforcement history. Her patient construction of the evidence and her careful revelation of the corruption network demonstrated the potential for professional law enforcement to triumph over systematic criminal conspiracy. However, the full implications of Operation Circuit Breaker would not be known for years to come, as the investigation continued to unfold, and as the American political and legal systems adapted to the revelations about the extent of corruption that had been operating within their institutions. The work of restoring public trust and ensuring accountability would require sustained effort from all branches of government and all levels of society. The success of the investigation depended not just on the professional skill of federal agents and prosecutors, but on the continued commitment of American citizens to demand accountability from their leaders and to support the institutions that made such accountability possible. The true victory of Operation Circuit Breaker would be measured by whether it contributed to stronger democratic institutions that were more resistant to corruption in the future. As the final evidence was secured and the last reports were filed, the dramatic events in Riverside County concluded with the recognition that justice, while sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail when dedicated professionals worked within institutions that supported the rule of law. The courthouse would reopen, the legal system would adapt, and the work of governance would continue with the knowledge that no one, not judges, not prosecutors, not corporate executives, and certainly not foreign adversaries, was above the law in the United States of America. The encrypted email that arrived on Director Reeves's secure terminal at 11:47 p.m. that evening contained intelligence that would drive the next phase of Operation Circuit Breaker. But its contents would remain classified until the investigation had progressed far enough to ensure that public revelation would not compromise ongoing operations or national security. The work of justice would continue in the shadows as well as in the light, as federal authorities pursued leads that extended far beyond what had been revealed in the dramatic arrests at the Riverside County Courthouse. The American people would eventually learn the full extent of what their government had discovered about corruption and foreign influence in their institutions. But for now, they could take satisfaction in knowing that dedicated federal agents and prosecutors were working tirelessly to protect the democratic principles that defined their nation's character and ensured its continued prosperity and security.